Let me just test the mic. Should we adjust this, or is this set up in a specific way?
About like Deb was
Okay.
but it's
All
not
right.
actually turned
Then I
on
will.
right now.
Okay. Okay.
What if you
I-
take it out?
Yeah, that would probably be better. Oops. All right. How is this working? A little bit more? A little bit more. Okay. All right. I think we're just about ready to get started. Okay. Welcome to the Jewish Museum of Maryland, and the next in our series of special lectures linked to our current exhibit, The Amazing Mendes Cohen. Before I introduce today's speaker, I have just a few announcements to make about upcoming programs. We've been doing some traveling with Mendes Cohen in the last month, first to Egypt, now to Israel, and for a few of our upcoming programs, you're going to need to do some traveling too. At 5 p.m. tonight, we are co-sponsors of the Community Yom HaShoah program at Beth Tefillah. Next Sunday, you'll find us at the Gordon Center at the JCC in Owings Mills in partnership with the Baltimore Jewish Film Festival. We're presenting the film Stateless, the story of Soviet emigres stuck in limbo in Italy in the 1980s. The film and a subsequent panel featuring the film's director, the author of the book, and the executive director of HIAS comprise this year's Herbert H. and Irma B. Risch Memorial Program on Immigration. The JCC tells me that more than 300 tickets have already been sold, so be sure to reserve your place if you're planning to go. On Thursday, April 30th, JMM is co-presenting the one-man play and lecture, The Mitzvah Project, featuring actor Roger Grunwald. Our co-presenters are the Baltimore Jewish Council and the Baltimore Hebrew University at Towson, which is where the play will take place that evening. The play involves the unusual story of the Mischlinge, I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that correctly, Jewish soldiers in Hitler's army. The RSVP for tickets can be found in the events section of our website. You'll find that at jewishmuseummd.org. Our next program is back here is in a reception for the artists who created the Braille exhibit that now graces our lobby. The youngsters will be here on May 3rd from 1 p.m. to 3 p.m. And then our annual Feldman Lecture is coming up on Thursday evening, May 7th, with American University scholar Pam Nadell speaking on the lives and contributions of Jewish women in America's first 50 years. And then finally, one more traveling program that I want you to put on your radar screen is on May 17th. We're calling it the Ultimate Mendes Cohen Experience. It is a bus tour that starts at JMM and runs through the Baltimore Hebrew Cemetery where Mendes is buried, the Archaeology Museum at Johns Hopkins, and the vaults of the Maryland Historical Society. It's a really rare opportunity to go behind the scenes of public facilities to unearth the reality of not just one exceptional life, but the lives of the whole community, the whole Jewish community of early Baltimore. And I have the privilege of serving as your host for this journey. We've trimmed the program back to 4 hours. We decided 7.5 hours was a little much, even for a Mendes Cohen fan. And the door-to-door price is now just $20 for members, $30 for non-members. See Trillion for today if you would like to sign up. Wow, that's a lot of journeys in less than a month, but it is nothing like the travails of the traveler we speak about today, Mendes Cohen, the first American tourist to Jerusalem and the Holy Land. And to be our guide through this journey, we are delighted to welcome back to JMM, Deborah Weiner. Deb is a historian and author whose work focuses on the American Jewish experience. For many years, she's been a key part of the JMM team, co-curating the museum's two core exhibits, Voices of Lombard Street and The Synagogue Speaks, as well as a traveling exhibit, Jews on the Move, the Suburbanization of Baltimore Jewry. She also co-edited the museum's magazine, Generations, and her talk today is based on a Generations article she wrote on Mendes Cohen. Deb received a Ph.D. in history from West Virginia University and has taught as an adjunct professor at Johns Hopkins University, UMBC, and the University of Baltimore. She is the author of Coalfield Jews, an Appalachian History, which was published by the University of Illinois Press in 2006 and is for sale in our museum shop. She is working on a new book along with co-author Eric Goldstein titled On Middle Ground, A History of the Jews of Baltimore, which is currently under contract with Johns Hopkins University Press. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in offering a warm welcome back to Deb Weiner. And hopefully I haven't moved it too much.
Hello, everybody. Feel free to let me know if you can't hear me at any time. If you're at all familiar with the museum's exhibition, you already know that this person here is Mendes Cohen. A pretty exotic-looking character, wouldn't you say? But here is another image of Mendes, closer to what he really was in daily life. Certainly closer to how he normally dressed. In this, Trillian, can you get that? So in this view, Mendes looks like, I think there's still one more spot to turn on. There you go. Is that good? I can see good enough. So in this view, Mendes looks, to me at least, like a rather arrogant and sort of haughty individual, which is basically what he was. But he was also much more. Mendes Cohen was a soldier and a banker, an amateur botanist and an anthropologist. He was a lifelong Baltimorean, a patriotic Jewish American, and an eager student of the Hebrew Bible. Above all, he was an adventurer. So my talk today is going to focus on these last few aspects of Mendes Cohen's identity. When you get to know him through his letters and journals, certainly the arrogance of this character shines through. But what really leaps out is a man who relished traveling through foreign lands and immersing himself in different cultures, who viewed the world with eyes wide open and serious intent, but maybe just a hint of self-mockery. In other words, this guy. More important from the standpoint of a historian, Cohen was a keen observer and a vivid writer. Also, he brought to his journeys the perspective of a proud American citizen and equally proud Jew. As a result, the letters he wrote back home to his mother and brothers during his 6-year trip through Europe and the Middle East offer an illuminating depiction of the places he went and a remarkable self-portrait of an early 19th century American abroad, though unfortunately his handwriting wasn't the greatest. Because he was one of the very first Americans to explore the Middle East, his descriptions provide a rare first-hand account of that part of the world during the early 19th century and are valuable for that reason alone. But while his observations give us a revealing look at what the land of Israel was like back then, his reactions to what he saw while traveling through the region known as Palestine give us an equally revealing look into the mind of a Jewish citizen of the young American Republic. Cohen's unshakable identity as an American and as a Jew stemmed from his upbringing. He was born in Richmond in 1796 to Israel Cohen, a Prussian immigrant, and his wife Judith, who came from England. His uncle Jacob was a Revolutionary War veteran and businessman who had employed Daniel Boone as a surveyor along the Ohio River. Mendes came to Baltimore with his mother and 6 siblings in 1808. At age 18, he was a defender of Fort McHenry against the British as a member of a local militia that included his brother Philip and friend Samuel Edding. Although well integrated into Baltimore society, the Eddings and the Cohen clans remained traditional Jews who kept kosher, held regular services, and received a thorough Jewish education. His brother Jacob led the fight for Jewish civic equality in Maryland, which was achieved with passage of the Jew Bill in 1826. So after his stint at Fort McHenry, Mendes joined his brother's banking and lottery firm, and for a time he managed their New York branch. But as the fifth of 6 brothers, and unmarried at that, he had the freedom and the wealth to do pretty much what he wanted to do with his life. And what he wanted during his 30s was to see the world. So Cohen set sail from New York to Liverpool on October 1829 on the packet ship Caledonia, which probably looked something like this. And as you can see from the very first pages of his journal, he enjoyed recording his travels and took great care in doing so. He traveled through England, France, Switzerland, Italy, Turkey, Syria, Palestine, Egypt, Bulgaria, Moldavia, Russia, Poland, Austria, and Germany before returning to the United States in 1893. 1835. Pardon? Oh, I don't know how you...
There's not a lot I can do about the focus, but I can tell you that there is a reproduction available in the exhibit, so you could go and you can really take your time and read over it in the exhibit, and I'm happy to show you that after the presentation if you'd like. I was actually just about to say, do you mind if I turn the volume up a little bit for people at the back?
Okay. Sure. Yeah, I don't know why the focus is out, because it looks great on the screen here. So he returned to the United States in 1835, so it was a 6-year trip. As member of a wealthy family during an age where very few Americans traveled overseas, he had access to top U.S. officials abroad, and through them to the highest levels of European society. He also hobnobbed with Europe's Jewish elite, becoming friendly with the Rothschild family and attending lavish parties at their home. Everywhere he went, he visited synagogues and made contact with local Jewish communities. He also toured the great cathedrals of Europe with the avid interest of a well-educated tourist. So these are just to give you just some of the idea of where Mendes went on his trip. Cohen was comfortable in almost any social situation, but as an American, he looked on European aristocracy with some disdain. In a letter to his brothers, he described a ceremony he attended involving the French king and his court, and he concluded, and this is a quote, "A more splendid pageant I never saw, which to a genuine Republican, a greater piece of nonsense and more unmeaning act perhaps could not be displayed, and makes one the more firm in simple and unostentatious principles." So Cohen's American chauvinism continued to influence his perceptions after he left Europe and embarked on a tour of the Ottoman Empire. He was proud to discover that he was the very first person to travel officially through the empire as a U.S. citizen, as he reported in a letter written from the Turkish port city of Smyrna, which was reprinted in a Baltimore newspaper in 1831. And he said, "I have just received my firman, which is the name for the official travel pass, from Constantinople. It is very full and explicit to give me aid, supply my wants, etc. through my travels. It is written on a sheet of paper about 2.5 feet square, the size of the paper constituting its importance. When it is presented to a Turk, he respects it by bowing, putting forward his head, and kissing the Sultan's signature at the top of the paper. It is, I believe, the first American firman which has been issued, our countrymen heretofore having been obliged to procure them through the English ambassador." So the firman ensured that Cohen would be received favorably by local officials as he traveled from Turkey through the empire's dominions, which included Syria, Palestine, and Egypt. And this map sort of highlights, although I guess it's somewhat blurry, what those are. Here, let's see, the upper left is Turkey, and then towards the center is Syria, and then the green section down on the left there is Palestine. The cooperation of local officials throughout his trip wouldn't guarantee a smooth journey. Compared to the tourism of today, the challenges Cohen faced once he left Europe seem almost laughably difficult. There were shipwrecks and sandstorms, war zones to travel through, and the plague to avoid. But through it all, Cohen seemed unfazed, a sort of early 19th century Indiana Jones. Fortunately, he cut a physically imposing figure, which helped him in some dicey situations. According to his 1834 passport, he stood 6 feet 2.5 inches, with hazel eyes, dark hair, fair skin, and common features. In fact, his trip from Turkey into the heart of the Middle East began with a shipwreck off the Turkish coast en route to Syria, which he described in 3 diary entries in December of 1831. Let's see here. Yep. I don't know if you can read this too well, but I will read it for you. One entry says, "Storm, 10 at night, rudder broke, danger imminent, locked up a stateroom to secure luggage." And then the next entry says, "Gulf of Satalia, wrecked, all hands saved." And finally, "Occupied in drying clothes, determined to journey now by land," which is probably a sensible thing. The few Americans that Cohen encountered in the Middle East tended to be missionaries. And here's a picture of a group of people he might have not directly seen, but they probably look something like this. This was from a little later, the 1850s. Reporting on the cholera epidemic that ravaged Smyrna when he was there, he noted with approval that Mr. Brewer, the American missionary here, has been indefatigable in his attendance on the sick, without distinction to Turk, Jew, and Gentile. These acts of kindness command the thanks of all classes. They render the American name conspicuous. So he was very proud of this missionary for helping out the people of Smyrna during this epidemic. Cohen's patriotism was most visibly on display during his epic 4-month, 2,000-mile journey up the Nile River and back, when this veteran of Fort McHenry hoisted the Star-Spangled Banner up the mast of his small vessel. A newspaper later stated that Colonel Cohen carried the first American flag that was ever seen on the Nile, the flag being one he made with his own hands. According to one account, it was made out of the shirts and the handkerchiefs of the sailors on the boat. According to another account, Cohen and his Arab servant made the flag themselves from materials purchased in a river town bazaar. Today, of course, it can be found right in the next room in the exhibition, so if you haven't seen the exhibition yet, I strongly recommend going through it. So Cohen traveled, let's see here, there we go, through Palestine twice. First in March 1832 on his way from Syria to Egypt, so from north to south, and then on his way back in September and October of 1832. So on the left, yeah, it's very blurry, but that's a map of Palestine as it looked in the early 19th century. And on the right is a current map of roughly the same area, just to give you a little bit of an idea of what I'm talking about. He visited Jerusalem, which I don't know if you can see on the bottom lower, there's a circled town on the sort of in the middle towards the bottom. That's Jerusalem. He visited Jerusalem on both legs of his trip, going down and then coming back up. But otherwise, his route, he varied his route so that he could stop at virtually every major biblical landmark then known, which he pointed out in his letters by citing the relevant chapter and verse each time he reached an important spot. So clearly he knew his Hebrew Bible. His first stop in Palestine was just outside of Akko, which is circled on the map up towards the top left. It's port town. He happened to arrive during the famously brutal siege of the town by the Egyptian army, headed by Ibrahim Pasha, who was attempting to conquer Palestine and Syria for his stepfather, the ruler of Egypt. But fortunately for Cohen, he enjoyed Ibrahim's hospitality and spent an entire week in the Egyptian camp, accommodated with a splendid tent belonging to Ibrahim's top aide. One morning, he even took coffee with Ibrahim Pasha and the admiral of the fleet. So here he sketched some scenes from the camp. He was a very good artist, actually, and sketcher, including on a description, the words on the right-hand side are of the meals that he was served while he was in the camp. I think the meals were very important to him, actually. He described himself as splendidly entertained. He ventured out each morning to witness Ibrahim's attack on the strongly fortified town. And he wrote, "Since my arrival, the firing of cannons and bombs have been incessant day and night. At one point, the town's walls were breached, but he wrote, when the Egyptian troops were driven back, I returned to my tent for breakfast." So he sketched this view of Acre here immediately after the assault of the Egyptian army. Cohen seemed quite enamored of the Egyptian army, and especially its westernized style. He really liked it that they had a marching band. He also was impressed with Ibrahim Pasha, whose own style might look just a little bit familiar. At least when I saw it, it reminded me of Mendes himself. But his enthusiasm for the war dimmed when he toured a field hospital filled with the cries of amputees and other wounded soldiers. He wrote, "I left the scene with feelings of deep emotion, thinking if our acts and deeds are judged in the next world, what must our rulers have to answer for when for some personal pique they plunge nations into war, sacrificing their subjects?" Nevertheless, he remained interested in Ibrahim's campaign, often reporting on its progress in his letters home. Mostly, though, Cohen occupied himself with exploring the region's biblical sites. And I should mention here that, of course, there was no photography in the 1830s, so a lot of the pictures that I use are from the 1850s and 60s to 90s, for the most part. From Acre, he traveled on horseback to Mount Carmel, where, he wrote, he visited the grotto where Elijah called the people and etc. and slew the false prophets. He stayed overnight at the Carmelite monastery, where he and his French traveling companions were kindly received. Cohen often found hospitality at monasteries and mosques, and often traveled with Christian tourists whom he met along the way. But lest his mother worry about the influence of a Spanish missionary with whom he shared many adventures, he wrote, "Priest Castro Gonsalves is a man of the most liberal sentiments and has enough to do in taking care of his flocks in various countries without meddling with the flock of another shepherd." So Cohen made his way south from Carmel with 3 horses, one for his luggage, one for his servants, and one for himself. So he pretty much traveled in style as much as he could wherever he went. He did spend an uncomfortable night outdoors, unable to sleep on account of the fleas, and traveled through a very unpleasant sandstorm, as he put it, to the site of the ancient Gilgal, Judges chapter 2, verse 1. He emerged into the valley of Sharon, which he described as a most beautiful and fertile country, thick in grass and clover, and enriched with about 30 different kinds of field flowers. He rested for the night at a mosque in an Arab village where, he wrote, "Lest I might not be admitted, my Arab guides told the keeper I was the head physician in the service of Ibrahim Pasha. This ensured the best quarters there were." The next day, he was at Jaffa, and shortly thereafter, he joined a trail of pilgrims bound for Jerusalem. Cohen entered Jerusalem through the Jaffa Gate, this is the Jaffa Gate, on a late Friday afternoon. He settled into his lodgings at the convent of St. Salvador and immediately set off in search of the synagogue, hoping to arrive in time for services. And this is a view from just inside the Jaffa Gate, from around 1870. Plunging through the old city, through narrow streets and teeming bazaars, he found himself swept along with a crowd of pilgrims into the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, one of Christianity's holiest sites, as Cohen put it, where Christ had been crucified, washed, buried, and almost 100 other things, to each of which there is an altar. When the flow of the crowd took him through a small, stuffy, and overcrowded chamber, he imagined himself within the very tomb of him whom the Gentiles seek. But somehow he managed to find his way out, and going through the bazaars, asked several persons, as well as I could, he said, as well as I could make them understand where the synagogues were. Finally, someone took him to the city's Ashkenazi synagogue, where he asked for Rabbi Mendel, whose name an American missionary had given him. So this view shows from 1900 the Jewish quarter of Jerusalem with the two synagogues, one the Ashkenazi synagogue and one the Sephardic synagogue. So he went to the Ashkenazi synagogue and asked for Rabbi Mendel, because that's the name an American missionary had given him. Cohen found Rabbi Mendel to be a man about 45 years of age, having a young wife, not homely. He wore a beard, and his headdress was a fur cap, which many of the congregants wore, being pilgrims from Russia, Prussia, Poland, etc. The rabbi invited him to supper after the service. The following morning in shul, Cohen was honored by being seated, as he put it, in one of the high places, and was called up for the blessing. And this is when he had perhaps the most uncomfortable moment of his entire trip, because he momentarily forgot the blessing. So after throwing his hosts into confusion, he suddenly remembered what to say, and as he put it, all things went right after that. The Jewish population of Jerusalem was divided into two different sects that live in friendly intercourse with each other, Cohen wrote. The largest are the Spanish and Portuguese, the smaller, the Skenarzim, which is how he referred to the Ashkenazi, each having their own head or grand rabbi to which the Jews of all parts seek for knowledge. During his 2 visits to the city, he would get to know both groups. His first visit to the Portuguese synagogue also occurred on a Sabbath. The 4 interconnected shuls of the synagogue complex seated between 120 and 300 persons each, much larger and more impressive than the Ashkenazi synagogue, which was understandable since the Sephardic population was both much, much larger and much older. He says, there were assembled in all the 4 shuls of the Portuguese synagogue several hundred of the nation, and a great many females in the window galleries. They all wore a white covering over their heads. He found that the women are as regular in attendance as the men. They are very devout, and without participating in the ceremonies, they are practically a part of the congregation. Over Rosh Hashanah, he proudly wrote to his mother, I had several honors, was called up as a Kohen both days, one day in the shul with the grand rabbi. The special treatment might have been partly due to the fact that the local population saw very few modernized Western Jews. In fact, their visits were so rare that Cohen saw fit to mention that a year or 2 ago, there were 2 of our people here from London, a Mr. Sampson and a Mr. and Mrs. Montefiore. So this, no doubt, was a reference to Sir Moses Montefiore, a British Jew whose 1827 life-changing visit to Jerusalem led him to become the great Jewish communal leader of the 19th century. But the Holy Land would not have this effect on Mendes Cohen. His letters reveal a person who was able to observe sympathetically, but with a fair amount of American-style skepticism, the situation of Jews in the Holy Land. Cohen placed his description of the Jewish community in the larger context of Jerusalem. The city, he wrote, contains about 12,000 inhabitants, of whom about 4,000 are Jews. The rest are Turks, Arabs, Greeks, Armenians, etc., and a few Franks. And Franks was a term that meant Europeans, apparently. At all times, the city's ranks swelled with pilgrims of all sorts. They are all the poor of the land, he said, ignorant and destitute of education, bestowing their little means on the numerous Turks who take any opportunity to fleece them. Misery, poverty, lameness, and blindness are visible at any step made through the streets of this once great city. The Jews, like everyone else, suffered at the hands of the rapacious Turks, in his terms, who governed Jerusalem. Very few of the Jews in Jerusalem have shoes, he remarked in one letter to his mother. I found, and is generally the case, 3 to 4 families within the walls of one house living together. They are generally poor. They also have to pay a certain sum each year to the Turkish governor. The few Jewish families of means were forced to conceal their wealth, lest the Turks make heavy exactions from the congregation. And the synagogues were already heavily taxed. As he put it, the whole appearance of these synagogues is that of poverty, as they are not allowed to build or add to their buildings without paying a large sum to the Turks. Cohen's American sensibilities were greatly offended by this situation, and he made his views known to his hosts. But, he says, it is in vain that I reason with them. America is the land of milk and honey, where each may sit under his own vine and fig tree, and none to make them afraid. But the rabbis have scripture too much at their finger ends, and they think they are bound to hold on to what once belonged to them. But his attitude toward the Turks did not prevent him from meeting with the local governor, who served him pipes and coffee and introduced him to several Arab chiefs. He also did plenty of sightseeing at Jerusalem's churches and bazaars. But he made sure to spend time with members of the Portuguese shul and recorded his impressions with the dispassion of an anthropologist. He went into much detail on relations between the sexes, especially. He says, I have seen very few single young girls. They marry when 12 or 13 years of age. The boys marry at about the same age. The whole is arranged by the parents, who have to continue to take care of the youngsters. The Jewesses do not cover their faces as the Christian and Turkish females. When they go out, they wear a handkerchief around their forehead and down each side of their ears. I was accompanied to the house of a young lady to pay my respects on the birth of a son, now 2 days of age. As the parlors are made into bedrooms when bedtime arrives, we were ushered into her presence. The parents and other females were at the bedside. The lady is 14 years of age. I was told by the chief rabbi of the Sephardim that a Jew may have more than one wife, and there are now some in Jerusalem having 2 and 3 wives. Cohen also encountered Jewish communities outside of Jerusalem during his 2 trips through the region. In Palestine, there are several cities of Jews, he explained. Nearly all the towns contain at least a few. They prove to be even poorer than their counterparts in Jerusalem. He observed Sukkot with the Jewish community in Nablus, but, he says, as they have found me out to be a rich man, I have been constrained to shorten my visit. Traveling to Hebron, which is pictured here, he passed through a town where all the Yehudim of the place heard that a Frank Yehuda was coming, and as their whole and sole object was to get a little cash from me, I disappointed them. Hebron had a population of 5,000, mostly Arabs, with around 300 Jews. Cohen went there to see Judaism's second holiest site after the Temple Mount, the Cave of Machpelah, burial place of the biblical patriarchs and matriarchs. That Jews were forbidden to enter the mosque that stood on the site did not deter him, though, he says, the first day I arrived, the Yehudim followed me so closely I could not get a chance to ask permission to see the interior. The next day, he bribed an attendant and went in. And this is the mosque that stands over the site. Cohen's disregard for obstacles of any kind proved to be a hallmark of his trip. When he was told that an excursion with some companions by horseback from Jerusalem to the River Jordan would be extremely dangerous, he secured a heavily armed guard from the governor of Jerusalem. We are 8 in number, all well armed, and have an escort of 15 soldiers and an Arab chief to accompany us. Persons going on this pilgrimage generally have much to fear from the Arabs looking daily for prey of robbery or plunder. However, in this case, he fell victim to a different kind of danger. Like the pilgrims he had observed before, he was being fleeced. 5 days later, he wrote and discussed, "A few women gathering herbs were all that we saw. I consider the whole thing as a farce and got up by the governor for the purpose of saving his own pocket, which by our not employing these Bedouins, he would have had to provide for himself." His guards were poor, miserable, almost naked and starved. Some of them appeared not more than 15 to 17 years of age. They had nothing to eat but what we could give them. Our stock of bread was small, and we had to put it under a rigid guard, otherwise in a few moments nothing would have been left. And he concluded, "All travelers speak of the excursion as a perilous one. I would have no objection to going alone on it." And this is, I think you could probably see the titles here. This is the trip that he took from Jerusalem over to the Jordan River and visited Jericho and finally ended up along the Dead Sea. And the places he visited were worth the aggravation. After stopping at Jericho and the well of Elijah, the group reached the Jordan and crossed over its shallow waters. And he wrote, "From the bed of the river, I took stones to serve as a memorial that my children may know that Israel came over Jordan on this ground." He also measured the river and found it to be 116 feet across, the deepest part not being more than 4 feet 6 inches. While there is a bank on one side, there is none on the other, and it is evident when Jordan overflows its banks at the time of harvest that it spreads its benefits over the land. So, having proved this biblical description to his satisfaction, he went on to the Dead Sea. The guards endeavored to alarm us for the purpose of hastening on by telling us the Bedouins would appear in a few moments from their secret places and attack us, but we were not to be intimidated so easy. But once he got to the Dead Sea, his experience would be familiar to modern-day tourists. Taking off our boots, we went some distance into it for the purpose of filling a bottle. On their return to Jerusalem, the group stopped at Bethlehem and Rachel's tomb. We entered within the outer wall to see the tomb itself, which was nothing remarkable, reported Cohen. But it did give him a chance to express his solidarity with the Jewish people. As he told his mother, "The names of thousands of the Yehudim are inscribed on its walls, to which I added mine in Hebrew." Cohen's passage through the Sinai Desert with 2 Christian missionaries typified his determination to pursue his adventures regardless of the difficulties. After he went to Egypt, he did this leg of the tour on his way back up through, from Egypt back up through Palestine. After securing diplomatic permission, he hired a Bedouin sheik as his guide. The sheik, he wrote, promises everything with his supply of men. He is to conduct me to Suez, to the top of Mount Sinai, and thence the direct road to Gaza, to point out to me the celebrated places and antiquities on the route. Thus, with a perfect understanding, my Bedouin sheik came with his 4 camels, to the gates of the convent where Cohen was staying. The camels were for Cohen, his servant, his luggage, and his water. The first challenge was learning how to ride the camel, which was awkward enough at the beginning, he wrote, but 2.5 days' journey has reconciled me to the mode as well as the utility. More worrying, our drinking water does not keep as well as we had expected. However, we have undertaken the journey and must submit to its many inconveniences. When his caravan reached one of the wells of Moses, he observed the water gurgling from the ground with more than the usual tourist's interest. Unfortunately, though, it was brackish and not drinkable. That night, he recorded in his diary, "The wind blew strong and our tent came down. All hands employed in getting it up. The next day," he jotted, "the sun intensely hot." Meanwhile, the perfect understanding between Cohen and the sheik did not last long. As he wrote in his diary, "I had much difficulty with him, having to dismount from my camel and punch him, knocking off his turban." In a letter to his mother, he explained, "My sheik objected to my going to Yor, the ancient Elam, had a quarrel with him, reminded him of his promises, gave him a rap on his head. He finally consented good-humoredly to go, provided that I would not take my luggage." So with this compromise, Cohen and the sheik went alone on their detour to meet up with the rest of their party and luggage on Mount Sinai. Later, the two would disagree over other issues, and Cohen ended up hauling the sheik before authorities in Gaza and getting his fee reduced. So you see sometimes the tour guides, just like today, he might, some of the troubles he faced are still faced by people today. Yet his journal entry and notes that he scrawled during the Sinai trip revealed a fascination with biblical history that made the hardships worthwhile. One day, he marveled that Moses and his army crossed the Red Sea not far from this spot. A few days later, his party reached St. Catherine's Monastery at the foot of Mount Sinai, the spot, they say, where Moses was herding his flock when the Lord appeared to him in the midst of a flaming bush. At one point, he hastily jotted down the sites he had come upon. Spot where tables of the law were thrown from the hands of Moses. Spot where the molten calf was made. Spot where the tabernacle was set up. Spot of the burning bush. The well from which Moses fed Jethro's flock. The ascent up the mountain took 3 hours. When he reached the top, he scrawled this note, and I don't know if you could read it, but it sort of expresses his excitement at reaching the top of Mount Sinai. The descent took 2 hours to go back down. Crossing a wide expanse the following day, he wrote, "I have no doubt the children of Israel passed over this plain. It is one which will contain several millions of people." So Cohen's final days in Palestine were a bit subdued. The dreaded plague broke out in Jerusalem toward the end of his second stay there, and he decided to keep a rigid quarantine until his departure. As he explained in a letter to his mother, the mortality of the cholera is not as great as that of the plague. Oops. I'll keep that there for a while. Let's see here. Where are they? There, Jerusalem. So with the latter, 1/2 or more who take it generally die. With the former, not more than 1 in 4. So he did venture out to a town where, he wrote, "Every Monday is held a large fair. I suppose there must have been 800 Arabs at it. They come from miles around." Noting their lively conversations, he commented, "I dare say politics is talked over in the same style as at Washington, though not allowed so publicly." No doubt, Cohen purchased some trinkets at this fair to add to the souvenirs that he collected on his travels. It would be an understatement to say that he enjoyed collecting. As you know, some of you might have come to last month's lecture here, the artifacts he brought back from his Nile trip constitute the first important American collection of Egyptian antiquities and are now ensconced in Johns Hopkins University. The collecting and observing that Cohen engaged in went far beyond the interest of the casual tourist. According to Israeli botanists, his detailed sketches and descriptions of the flora of Palestine constitute the most complete record of 19th century flora of the land of Israel. He also kept a study notebook where he described all kinds of phenomena listed alphabetically. In entries such as abraxas, crocodile, and rings, he carefully recorded the customs of the people he encountered as well as their natural surroundings. Cohen picked up souvenirs at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre to give to his Christian friends, and of course, he also made sure to gather items that reflected his engagement with his Jewish heritage. "I have a bottle of water of the Jordan and one of the Dead Sea, with some other little etceteras picked up at Jerusalem," he wrote in one letter. In another, "I am getting made a few tefillin and mezuzahs, and perhaps may have a Torah scroll made." So, in his preoccupations, his actions, his friendships, and his confidence, Mendes Cohen seemed always to be perfectly secure in his identity as an American, as a Jew, whether at home or abroad. Far from being in conflict, these two defining aspects of his life were, for him, mutually reinforcing. As he lectured the Hebrews of Jerusalem, America is the land of milk and honey, where none could make them afraid. In other words, he was a patriotic American in part because America's tradition of religious tolerance enabled him to live as a proud Jew. And yet, Cohen may have had his doubts. His letters and journal do not reveal him to be especially introspective. It's interesting then that his study notebook begins with 4 lengthy Bible quotes that he painstakingly wrote out that appear to have had special meaning for him. All of them admonish the Israelites to not act like others and to remain a people apart. One quote that he wrote out from Leviticus served as a summation. "After the doings of the land of Egypt wherein ye dwell, shall ye not do, and after the doings of the land of Canaan, whither I bring you, shall ye not do, neither shall you walk in their ordinances." Cohen returned to Baltimore in 1835 and became a civic leader. He served in the Maryland legislature, became a director of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, and was awarded the honorary title of colonel because of his service at Fort McHenry. He also took his place as a Jewish community leader, serving as vice president of the Hebrew Benevolent Society for more than 20 years and sitting on the board of the Hebrew Orphan Asylum. Upon his death in 1879 at age 83, obituaries recounted Cohen's exploits at Fort McHenry and as a world traveler. They also emphasized his religious commitments. As the Baltimore Sun put it, he was always a firm upholder of the faith of his fathers. The obituaries also did a good job of capturing his personality. Colonel Cohen was one of the oldest and most highly respected citizens of Baltimore, stated one. He often entertained his friends by describing scenes and incidents of his travels. Although he was blind the last 3 years of his life, he was almost daily on the streets, attended by a servant. His tall and commanding figure could frequently be seen on North Charles, near the scenes of his early activity. He was a man of action to the end. Thank you. So I'd be glad to answer questions if anybody has any. Oh, yes.
Do you know anything about the postal system?
Well, actually, I think there's something about that in the exhibition, isn't there? About the postal system and how he got these letters off and how whether he received letters in return. I think he had a hard time receiving letters.
Yes.
But his letters did make it home.
Each letter begins with a very detailed description of how the letter is going to make it home. And so he has to give notice that he's giving this to so-and-so, who will give it to the next person, who will then deliver it by packet boat to the port. So the person who worked with us, the researcher on translating is my term for the letters, because the handwriting is so hard to read, on deciphering the letters, he had to go through this elaborate description in nearly every letter of how the letter was being moved before it got to the part of the content of the letter.
So it was all privately delivered. There was no national postal system.
There was a postal system when you got here,
Yeah.
but to get it out of Europe or the Middle East in particular required a lot of forethought as to how it was going to make it back to the American postal.
I'm guessing that if travelers, like say a missionary was returning, he might have given a letter to him, or that kind of thing. Probably people he knew he would trust with some letters. Julia.
Possibly related, but he was gone traveling for 6 years, and he obviously had the wherewithal to pay for all this. How did one carry that amount of money for 6 years?
Yeah, there's a lot of logistics that I couldn't quite figure out. I mean,
As best as we can figure this out, the Rothschilds, who remember his relationship, had already begun their banking system in Europe and a way of sending money from one country to another. And it seems to me, given the relationships and the fact that he keeps showing up at these coronations, which again suggests he needed a letter of introduction, that the Rothschilds were helpful to Mendes in his travels.
Yeah, and I think this travel pass he had from the Sultan also gave him entry, whether he was paying or not. We don't, a lot of the places he went to, he was a guest. He was being treated to the hospitality of the empire because he had this letter from the Sultan saying, treat this person with respect. Yeah.
In his letters, he keeps saying, I talk to this one, I talk to that one. How many languages did this guy talk?
Now that's an excellent question, because one question I had was, how did he communicate with these people throughout his trip? And I never really found a great answer to this. He spoke a lot. I'm sure he spoke a number of European languages, and he knew biblical Hebrew, but of course there was no modern Hebrew. I don't think he knew Arabic, but I think he found people to translate for him along the way. At one point, he says, when he was in Jerusalem, he met a Jewish man who spoke Italian, and this man who was a member of the Portuguese shoal, and this man helped him communicate. But he talks about these conversations he had with people, and you know, describes them and goes at length and I'm thinking, well, how did he really communicate with these people? And that's something I never found reference to in his letters. So it's a little bit mysterious. Yeah, in the back.
You say, I think you said, I'm not sure, that the Jewish ones wore scarves on their head and on the sides of their
Yeah,
face?
what he saw was they had, like, the Arab and Christian women were more covered up, but the Jewish women just had like a kerchief on their head that came down the sides of their face. Yeah.
So he traveled with servants. Do we know anything about the servants? Whether he had the same servant throughout, or he hired them various times?
I don't think he really said. He changed, the people who were helping him sort of changed. I think he got people locally. In Cairo, for example, he hired people to go with him through Sinai. But then once he got to Gaza, he probably hired other people to take him back to Jerusalem. I think that because there were so many pilgrims going to the Middle East from all countries, not so many Americans, but there were, you know, a number of Europeans, and there was probably a tourist industry of a sort there, servants and guides who would help travelers.
The census records, there were only 2 servants in the Cohen household, 2 slaves initially, 2 servants later. And so it's unlikely that he brought someone from home because his mother would have needed assistance, etc. So it's probable that he picked people up along the way.
Anybody else? Oh, yeah.
He collected all these objects,
Mhm.
and from the picture, they were fake. I mean, did we have the cart them with him, or did we ship them back to the U.S.?
Well, he must have shipped them back. There's no way he would have carted them. He's talking about the objects that he collected. A lot of logistics are not really spelled out in his letters, so, but again, I think it would be similar to trying to send the letter. He must have had gone to great lengths to figure out how to ship them. But he also had the means to pay, to do whatever it took, so, yeah.
I assume you got much of your information from his letters, maybe from some newspaper writings. Is there any records of anybody else talking about him, like the Rothschilds when he visited them, or you know, any
Not
other-
that I know of. Not that I know of. There are. Did you find some?
One Rothschild letter. Remember that he's small potatoes compared to the Rothschilds, so they know him friendly with him, but not central to their lives.
But on the other hand, the way he talked about them was very familiarly. It's like, oh, I went over to see, Manny the other day, and it was, one of the Rothschild. But he was writing to his mother and his brothers, so it was clear that they were on what you'd say were familiar, definitely familiar terms. Yeah.
I would suggest that since it was so difficult to get these letters home, that probably some didn't make it. And in those letters that didn't make it might be the secrets to some of those.
Maybe it's quite possible. But each letter that you see, I think I showed some of the letters, was covered several days. So like he scrawled all around, and that might be, he sort of kept the letter going, over several days, and when I think he had filled it up, he would send it off. So it might talk about, the past 8 days of his journey.
Didn't he write some of those letters backwards between the lines?
Did he do that? Yeah.
Upside down, and then sometimes he goes around the edges of the
He
document.
definitely went around the edges. Yeah.
What was the size of his estate at the time of his death?
The size of his estate at the time of his death. That I do have.
Reckon
Oh, okay. I have no
there's-
idea.
There's a record of his will, and it is at least in the neighborhood of $50,000-$60,000 plus 5 homes. Because he gives 10,000 to one niece, 10,000 to another, 5,000 to a nephew. So when you start to add up all the dollars, it was, for that day and age, for 1879, it was an absolute fortune that he's the last of the siblings.
He was the youngest, you mean,
Well,
to survive?
he's the last surviving. There were younger
Right.
siblings, but they died
Right.
before he did.
Did he have any children?
He had no children.
No spouse.
He never married. He and many of his brothers didn't
Right,
marry.
3 of the brothers had no
Many others did, though. But, his oldest brother, Jacob, was the one who was really the impetus for the family fortune. Jacob was a very prominent citizen of Baltimore and served on the city council and was responsible for starting up the banking business and ran a lottery, which was kind of similar to the lottery today, which was a main way to fund many civic improvements. So, yeah.
That must have been very unusual for three of the brothers never to marry, wasn't it?
Well, I think among the Jews of that early time, now we're talking about before the real migration of German Jews to America started in the really 1820s and didn't really get going till later. When he was a young man, there was only like 150 Jews living in Baltimore at that time. And if what he really wanted was to marry a Jewish woman, his options would have been very limited. So that may explain it, or it may not explain it. We really don't know. There may have been other reasons too. I don't know. Yeah.
The way money was transferred in those days was by letter of credit. And being a banker, that's what he
Right.
wanted.
So all he would need would be a letter to give to somebody saying.
Yes, but what happened, this is why one of the things that the Jewish community in particular made a lot of money on. If you have large families that trust one another, that are scattered around the world, I could issue a letter of credit to my cousin Shlomo in Romania, and when the person getting there has the letter of credit, then the person at the other end would issue money to them, and this is how money was transferred.
Right.
And the Jewish community was big on this for all along, which is how the Rothschilds got started.
Right.
And that's how you did trade, is because you had people at one end that would trust somebody mainly because they were related to them. Maybe
Right,
a distant
yeah.
cousin, but this was common, particularly in certain religious and national groups, for example, Quakers also, because they had families that were scattered and they were religious groups.
Right, yeah. That's one advantage of a diaspora kind of community, is that you would always have connections around the world that could be used in trade, whereas other local people wouldn't have those kind of connections. So, wait, in the back? No, his parents were not American born. His father was from Prussia, and his mother came from England. I'm not sure if she was of Sephardic background or not. They met and married in the U.S., and all their children were born in the U.S. And by the time he was born, they had lived in the U.S. for many, many years, because he was, like I said, one of the younger children.
I'm curious, since he had no descendants and so many of his siblings, had predeceased him, who saved? How did all of this material?
Well, one interesting thing is that his nephew, whose name was Mendes Cohen, causing no end of confusion, was the president of the Maryland Historical Society. And so I guess his generation, I'm not sure who Mendes's father was, the nephew's father was, but he was involved in gathering up all the Cohen papers and giving them to the Maryland Historical Society, and that's why a lot of it is saved, all because of this second Mendes Cohen, who was very interested in making sure that the family records were saved. In the back there, yeah.
It was mentioned that somebody should be taking care of the mom while he was traveling. If he was in his 30s, how old was the mom? And the brothers were still alive, right?
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Well, how old was the mom at that point that she was so traveled at age, what, 50, 60?
Well, I'm saying that the servants in the household were generally there because people like Judith Cohen didn't do their own laundry. I mean, the servants were needed as part of the household, because if you lived that lifestyle, you didn't do the housework. You either had a slave in the early days, or you hired a servant later on.
Yeah, in the back.
In all this correspondence with all this extended family around the world, is there anything that says that they wanted to introduce these Cohen bachelors to anybody?
focused on the Middle East, so I'm not up on that.
One letter in Turkey, where
Yeah.
he says that his host, his Turkish host, he jokes with the host that the host needs to find him a bride. But, it's not clear that that's anything but a joke. We honestly don't.
There is also another letter when he's in somewhere, Europe, I'm going to say like France or England, where he does make reference to there being lots of young women that are trying to dance with him, but he's not. The phrasing indicates that he's not hugely interested in tying himself down at the moment. I can't remember the exact phrasing, but it's early on in his travels.
Anybody else?
Other questions?
Thanks.
Well, very briefly, before everybody gets up, a couple of reminders. We have our 2 o'clock synagogue tour. We'll be leaving from the front desk very shortly. If you've not been on that before, I strongly recommend it. And Deb is also available to sign copies of her book. They're available to purchase in the gift shop, and she'll be available to sign them. It's not about Mendes Cohen, admittedly, but